Cool. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming to my Watson presentation. So my Watson in general terms was focused on the science of river systems. And specifically, I was coming at it from kind of a science communication perspective. And really the premise that I knew about all of these various kind of intertwining scientific phenomena that occur within rivers and around rivers, or that rivers mediate. And I wanted to see how they play out in people's lives around the world. And I kind of wanted to tell those stories predominantly through photography. And so, the nature of this kind of diffuse, largely kind of cobbled together year was that it played out in all sorts of kind of unpredictable and not always linearly connected ways. So, in the interest of making kind of repackaging it into a little more of a tolerable Zoom call, I basically decided to tell one of those stories and try and stick to the area that I spent most of my time during my Watson before I got called home for COVID-19, which was the Andes and the Amazon. So today, I am going to focus on one of the stories that I think is really interesting. Knowing that unfortunately that means I leave out a lot of things that I did and people who helped me out along the way, but hopefully, sticking with the premise that less is more when it comes to Zoom calls, which I know we're all pretty tired of. So without further ado, let's get going. So I want to start this story with these small mountain river valleys on the slopes of the Andes in Ecuador. And this is a place where something pretty amazing is happening. Basically, you have the Andes being washed away boulder by boulder and broken down and shipped downstream to eventually become the soil and the ground of the Amazon rainforest. And to me, this is a place that epitomizes some of the ideas that I was exploring on my Watson, because it is a place and a scene that is made so much richer by understanding the science of what is going on, by being able to kind of see into and see beneath the surface of this this relatively normal natural setting, and understand how it fits into this massive and really important system that has all kinds of implications for people thousands of miles away. So to understand this a little bit better, we need to zoom out and understand a little more about how the world's biggest watershed functions. So if we zoom out from these mountains on the eastern coast of the Andes, where that photo was taken, we can start to kind of get our surroundings. And this is in the eastern part of Ecuador, and as we zoom out, you can kind of see the Andes Mountains over here on the left. And vanishing off into the right is this vast green expanse of the Amazon rainforest. And it's crisscrossed by all these massive rivers that eventually come together, culminate in this one giant thread, which is the Amazon River, and which eventually empties out into the Atlantic. So you can think of the Amazon basin as kind of a giant tilted funnel or plate, with the high point on the left being the Andes Mountains, and the low point, or the point where it all pours out, being this nick right over where the Amazon enters the Atlantic. And any water that lands anywhere within this massive area ends up flowing in that direction, flowing downhill, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in general, in kind of broad strokes, a lot of what I did on my Watson year was following that river, and seeing where it went, and seeing what that water does along the way. So I am going to kind of mangle the chronology a little bit of what I did in favor of keeping this nice and neat geographically, but I want to start telling this story here at one of the points at the very top of the Andes, near the point where the South American continent is divided into two very different sets of watersheds. So this massive volcano here is Volcan Antisana, and it's the same mountain that is pictured here. This mountain is about 18,500 feet tall, and it's one of the high points on the continental divide in Ecuador, which means that any water that falls on this side, the side that we're looking at, of the mountain will eventually flow west to the Pacific, and any water that falls on the other side will become part of the Amazon watershed, eventually flowing all the way to the Atlantic. And I want to start here not only because it's at the very top of the watershed, and it's where a lot, it's places like these where a lot of the rivers that eventually cross the Amazon begin, but also because the rivers here and the water here has a lot of important impacts right from the get-go. So this ecosystem is called the Paramo. It's a high alpine grassland, and it doesn't have a lot of rivers, or at least not a lot of externally flowing water. But what it does have is a ton of really thick, really rich topsoil that harbors an absolutely massive subterranean reservoir of water. And so you can really see the when you come up to these ecosystems, they have these meters upon meters of this really rich soil that is so dense and such a high capacity for storing water that if you wring it like a sponge, it literally just splooshes water out. And so these landscapes, while not really, not really being a river in your typical sense, are kind of a really interesting embodiment of how watersheds exist on the surface of Earth pretty much everywhere you go, as as kind of an organizing principle, as the shapes that impact how water moves through landscapes. And so in the Paramo here, you see, even though you don't see a lot of flowing rivers or kind of rivers as they would be familiar to you, there's a huge amount of water being moving through this landscape, and eventually being slowly released into rivers downstream. And that's all important because a ton of the biggest mountain cities in the tropics rely on ecosystems like this as really the only watersheds upstream of them that can funnel water down to the city. So I was based while I was learning about these places. I was based in Quito, Ecuador, and this is a classic example. The whole city of Quito is around 10,000 feet of elevation, and it gets a ton of its water from these high alpine Paramo ecosystems that basically offer this ecosystem service of storing and filtering a massive portion of the water that the Quito residents eventually drink. And this ecosystem service is so valuable to Quito that the water utility, the part of the government that's actually responsible for managing Quito's water resources, ultimately figured out that for every dollar they spent conserving this ecosystem and making sure that this ecosystem service is in place, they could save $5 for for the filtration and the storage and all of these things that they would otherwise have to implement themselves. So in the case of Quito, they actually set up a fund that is funded by a certain portion of Quito residents' water bills that goes towards preserving and buying up parcels of this Paramo ecosystem and studying it and understanding how water moves through it. And so it was actually working with this group that I was able to spend a lot of time up here. Um, if we as we move down through the watershed a little bit and past the Paramo, we start to get into these mountain river ecosystems, where the rivers gain a lot of volume and power, and as they come down through the mountains, they are affected by this really steep gradient. And so if you consider a river to basically just be water moving downhill, the steepness of that hill will impact how fast that water is moving, and the speed of that water impacts what it can do to its surroundings. So people don't think of these rivers, this kind of stage of the river life cycle, as super valuable or super important, and at least in part because it is often really dangerous and wreaks a lot of havoc on human ecosystem through flash floods, through landslides. But because of that energy, because of that steep gradient, this stage, this mountain river stage of the river life cycle, especially in the Andes, has a really, really important role to play downstream. And that is basically because it's where the processes that rivers carry out are at their most extreme. So that was a that was a clip from a mountain river in Peru that kind of showcases this immense ability of these rivers to transport sediments, to really tear up the landscape as they, when they're in these flood stages, they're really just ferocious. And the impact of that is that rivers have this ability to break down rocks and really tear up the bedrock of the Andes. And that not only supplies just the raw material, the sands and the sediments that ultimately downstream regions need, but it carries out a really important chemical process as well. And that is basically that as these rocks are broken up and as they get increasingly large surface area, they actually react with water to dissolve out and liberate a number of nutrients and minerals that most organisms on Earth depend upon. So phosphorus, zinc, iron, calcium. There's a ton of the kind of the nutrients that we are, that anybody is familiar with as like the things that humans, but all things need to be able to consume that are really created by this process of rivers moving through landscapes, breaking up rock matter, and helping provide that to ecosystems downstream. So through these processes of breakdown, mountain rivers have a really important role in fertilizing the stuff that is below them. And one of the main ways that I got to engage with rivers in this stage was from a kayak, which I found to be a really, really cool way to just be immersed in these landscapes, and be constantly kind of aware of and reminded of the processes that are occurring there. So it's crazy to be kayaking among these giant boulders and be understanding that I was in the graveyard of the Andes, that these boulders were pulled from mountainsides higher up and being broken down and shipped off downstream to the Amazon. And seeing the river as this ongoing process helped me notice kind of all the ways that people rely on that process and the products of it. So immediately, like on the banks of the river and downstream, you see a ton of mining activity, and people taking advantage of basically the mechanical breakdown of rocks that rivers affect. One of the biggest ways you see this is in gold mining. So a lot of the rivers in the Andes concentrate and kind of filter, or not filter out, but they basically accumulate gold as they break down these rocks. And this is an important source of income for a lot of people who do these like really small scale kind of panning on the side of the river operations. But it is also a huge problem because there are these corporations that come in with backhoes and just tear up the sides, the river banks, and destroy all sorts of habitat and forest ecosystem. And you also see people just mining the sediments themselves. So these gravels, these kind of large cobbles that you can see on the riverbank here, are super useful for construction material and for building, aggregate and concrete. All of these things that people normally would have to break down rocks themselves for, they can kind of take advantage of the river processes that are doing this automatically. But you run into problems again where people are coming in and they're pulling out all these sediments, and it kind of radically changes how the river behaves and how it flows through its landscape. Um, other ecosystem services that the rivers start providing is just like sewage and trash management. And this is kind of a mixed bag, because obviously it's not super ideal that people dump raw sewage and trash in the river, but in many places this is really the only way that sewage gets dealt with. So having these rivers kind of constantly carting away refuse, washing out the landscape is another huge thing that people use it for. And then you also have dams. So hydropower is in many ways like a really critical resource for some of these places, something like 45% of Ecuador's power comes from this dam alone, on a mountain river. But when you harness that same steepness and energy that define these mountain rivers and allow them to transport sediments and to liberate nutrients, you stop the flow. All of those sediments settle out in the reservoir, which you can already see in this reservoir here. It's these massive sandbanks of settled out sediments, and it kind of robs the river of their ability to carry out their fundamental role in the landscape. Um, and beyond that, beyond just kind of misunderstanding the river process and what is important about it, some of these dams, specifically this one, are really just poorly planned because in this case it's built under a volcano that was doing this when I was arriving. um, and the implications of building these massive infrastructure projects that not only really disrupt how these rivers work, but also are in one of the most tectonically active regions on the planet, is pretty worrisome in a lot of cases. um, but this is an interesting segue to just talk about the fact that volcanism is also, like, even as these mountains are getting torn down, the Andes are still growing and they're still being built up in large part by volcanoes. So all over the Andes, you kind of have this push and pull of uh, active mountain building processes alongside the rivers that are tearing them down, to the point where in some cases you have these rivers that flow straight through lava flow deposits that were deposited, coating the landscape in these huge flood basalts, some of which actually came from Antisana, that huge 18,000 foot volcano that we saw in the very beginning. Um, so as rivers start to leave the Andes, they kind of trickle down out of these really tumultuous, energetic phases of their life cycle. And they've gained a ton of volume, gained a ton of sediments. And then they hit what is, basically this giant flat floodplain, and they start to flatten out and kind of calm down. And as they lose that energy and become these kind of slower, fatter, flatter rivers, they open up a whole range of new ways that people relate to them. So you have these, the biggest and the most immediate one you notice is that these rivers go from this kind of terrifying, tumultuous, like really unnavigable stretches to what are effectively these, the best highway that exists through these rainforest ecosystems. So people out on the Amazon use the rivers as their main thoroughfare for getting everywhere. You also see these bigger rivers maintaining and supporting these much richer fisheries, these really like massive and super diverse kinds of fish that people rely on really heavily for their income and their food resources. You also just see people relating to the river, in more of a fun way. Fundamentally, it's a lot less energetic, a lot less dangerous. And so, you have people swimming in the river, people bathing in the river, people just using the river as this kind of, uh, this factor in their landscape that provides so many services. And so the utilities of the rivers, throughout the kind of the foot of the Andes into the Amazon, in many ways are really obvious. You see people interacting with them in those kind of clear cut ways. But I also really found it interesting to think behind the scenes and kind of apply what I understood about how the science and the geology and the biology of what was going on here was playing out and was having repercussions that weren't as clear. And so it was really interesting to think that the same sediments that started as boulders in the Andes, were now making up these milky waters that have these spectacular confluences and building the sandbars that people use to fish. And the nutrients from those rocks fertilize and build this whole forest ecosystem by nurturing the phytoplankton and detritivores that the whole food webs are built on. So everywhere in the Amazon, you see the legacy of what was happening upstream. And when you're looking for it, you just kind of see how rivers are continually changing the landscape as they move across it. So even once they get out onto the, this flat Amazon floodplain, they're constantly changing course, constantly meandering. This is actually a drone panorama from a town on one of the bends of the Ucayali River, where if you can see in kind of the distance, the two curves of the river are extremely close together, and that curve is getting smaller every year as they erode at the outside edge where the water moves the fastest. So sometime in the next decade, the river is expected to basically change course and take the shorter path by bridging those two curves. And so, even these massive monumental landscape features are kind of constant change. And when that happens, river communities like this town uh, are are kind of put up to the pretty immense challenge of accommodating that and figuring out what they're going to do once their source of transportation and once their source of food and sewage management jumps its banks and moves somewhere else. So while I was out on the Amazon floodplain, I also got to spend a fair amount of time with indigenous people whose lives really revolve around the river. And this was, in many ways, I think for me, a really interesting way to grapple with a different approach to this river lens. So obviously, so many of the just aspects of everyday life are related to the river, but especially in the Amazon, a lot of indigenous worldviews take this really kind of holistic, kind of personified approach to understanding animals, plants, and natural phenomena. So I think, throughout a lot of my journey, I was taking this approach of trying to, understand rivers and kind of confer their significance and their magnitude and their importance by understanding them in terms of all of these constituent processes, all of these little things that they break down into. But it was also really interesting to find that, like, on the ground, that's just not how a lot of people think about them. There's, I think within most of these communities, most of these people who actually live on the river, the river is so much more of kind of a personified entity, something that is very much part of their community, as well as just kind of this ever present source of services and and things that they rely on. So for indigenous communities more than anyone, the river is it's the pantry, it's the highway, it's their washing machine, it's their bathtub, it's their playground. um, and the river is also it's kind of rich with local knowledge and this oral history and this legacy that preserves how these rivers have been the inroads for violence and trauma at the hands of white Westerners. So a lot of these communities are still kind of dealing with the outcomes and the fallout from the era when people from Europe and people from the Americas came flooding in, traveling up the Amazon and the local rivers in search of rubber latex and in search of all these products that were kind of being discovered in the Amazon, and absolutely horrifically subjugated and took advantage of these communities. So there's all these really interesting levels to just like what the rivers represent in these people's lives. Um, so as you move further downstream, you see a lot of these things that rivers represent to people just being scaled up. When this is in Iquitos, Peru, which is the largest city in the Peruvian Amazon, and you watch these unbelievable quantities and just size of fish being brought in from all over the Amazon to be sold at these massive fish markets. And alongside that, like all kinds of other animals, you see poached caiman and alligator. There's all these turtles, there's livestock that are being bred all over the Amazon. So the rivers continue to act as this massive kind of accumulator and transport system of goods. And as the number of stakeholders and just kind of the scope of the industry and population that are being supported through that grows, you start to see like all of these kind of conflicting scales, these tiny handmade canoes jostling with these massive river barges. And more and more you see kind of freight being moving on the river, all these people and all these goods using the river as a main thoroughfare. And this really only gets more, more pronounced as you go further downstream. By the time you get to Manaus in Brazil, you start seeing, these massive ocean tankers that can make it all the way up to Brazil, and all the way up through Brazil, and the pressure to kind of keep expanding that highway and that thoroughfare and use the river as a transportation system in that way, kind of regardless of the processes that are operating within it, is leading to all these movements to try and dredge the bottom of the Amazon and create basically a shipping channel that extends all the way up into Peru, by tearing out the bed of the river, and that kind of just fundamentally misses the understanding of like how these rivers work as a dynamic landscape that is constantly changing, constantly moving more material downstream. So yeah, I think throughout my time, I ended up traveling the entire length of the Amazon, all the way from one of the sources in Peru all the way down to the delta in the Atlantic, and in traveling on these riverboats that ship cargo and passengers and seeing all of these various uses, I think that the understanding the river in that way kind of constantly provided this lens and this way of understanding it that was really, really interesting. I also got to fulfill the personal dream of seeing the river get so wide that the opposite bank is lost behind the curve of the earth, which happens down towards the delta when it's far and away the largest river in the world. It gets larger than the next 7 rivers combined. So yeah, I mean, even as the river kind of starts to transcend like what rivers everywhere else mean, and just like is in so many ways in a category entirely of its own, I think understanding the Amazon and in any river kind of continued to imbue it and the landscapes that flow through with kind of this action and meaning. So yeah, with that, I hope that now this image kind of somewhere nestled in the middle of that long journey, is kind of a little more richer for you as well. I think like the understanding the landscapes and the rivers that flow through them in terms of this big action and this big adventure, is something that I'm really interested in, and hope that I kind of captured some little parts of that. Yeah, this is the end. I have too many people to thank on one Zoom call, but thank you to all of you who are already in this call who helped me in various ways. And yeah, I wanted to open it up for questions or anything that anyone wanted to talk about. Stop sharing. Let's see. My video's off. There we go. Amazing. Can someone talk? I don't actually know if
How long did it take you to go from those first kayak runs down to the Delta?
So that was kind of the disclaimer I made at the beginning, is that I mangled the actual chronology a little bit in favor of, giving it a little more of a concise kind of geology or geographic narrative. But I was doing that kayaking sometime in October, I think, and I ended up finishing the kind of the riverboat journey sometime in February. But there was a number of different stops in between there. I ended up, going from being on the flanks of the Amazon in Ecuador. I ended up going all the way down, like deep into the Amazon in Peru, and then I went all the way back, like up into the Andes, hiked to the source of the Amazon at 17,000 feet, then like came all the way back down, like took riverboats all the way from, yeah. So it's definitely a convoluted journey.
It was an extraordinary presentation. I just loved it. It makes me want to leap on a plane right now, which we won't do. But the other thing I wanted to ask you was, when they do all the dredging and that serious move to get the biggest ships as far up as they can, what does that do to the dynamics of the river, and how does moving all that sediment and silt affect things?
Yeah. I am definitely like not the, the hydrogeologist that would be necessary to answer that question super, effectively. But one of the really big impacts that a lot of indigenous people are worried about is that the shallow regions of the river house a lot of the fish. They're, super prominent habitat feature. And so the sandbars, or even just the kind of the shallower areas, are a big part of just kind of how the ecosystems in the river work. And I think, people who live on this river just know it like the absolute back of their hand. And so the prospect of kind of destroying whole chunks of the underwater terrain and changing it in that way is, I think, a big concern to them, just because it's really hard to know specifically what it'll do. But and on the other hand, it's also, in my mind, just kind of like insane and hopeless, because it's like this river transports 1 billion tons of sediment every single year. Like it, there's the prospect of like permanently, trying to clear the bed and change just what it wants to do is kind of comical.
So Jeremy, when we were in the Amazon, the president was saying something about putting river lights all along the Amazon. Did that happen?
Sorry, I missed putting what?
Oh, putting like lights on the river, all along the river.
Oh.
Did that happen?
Not when I was there. That's crazy.
Yeah. Okay.
Jeremy, I have a question. Also, beautiful photography and presentation. Thank you. So you talked a little bit about conservation efforts near the headwaters and, experiencing those as far as, preserving the river as almost a municipal water source. I'm curious how you saw conservation efforts change as you followed the river towards its delta, and if you saw or experienced conservation efforts further down as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I was, I could have done a better job of like staying in my lane in some way, trying to like focus on what, one aspect of river conservation looked like in many different places. But I ended up kind of bouncing around. But I would say, I think like, up higher, you have this kind of fundamental limit of water availability. It's for Quito, at least, it's, it can be a pretty dry place. There's definitely concerns about meeting the needs of the population. So things like water storage and, water access, water cleanliness are all pretty important. Once you get down to, Iquitos, the really big city in the Peruvian Amazon, the Amazon is already massive. Like it's either already the biggest river in the world or very close to it. And it has like, 60% of its watershed left to go. And so like the, questions of like access to water, or even water cleanliness, are just completely irrelevant. So like, you can be dumping a full city's worth of raw sewage in the river, and the dilution factor is so massive that like, I never heard people talking about like, okay, we really need to like stop putting sewage in the river, because it's just like, the things that I think I grew up like fixating on, of like, oh, like you really need to be careful about polluting a river, when you're dealing with this scale, are, I think, just very different. That said, I think one kind of constant is just that the understanding that what happens on land impacts what happens in the river. So, there's all these studies, you know, there's all these studies about how like the forest and the land terrestrial ecosystems on the banks of the Amazon impact like the fisheries, the function of the seasonal floods, the actual just amount of precipitation. So there's definitely focus on like, if you're going to preserve the river and maintain this ecosystem, you need to be dealing with the rainforest that surrounds it. Or, if you're up in the mountains, you need to be dealing with the agriculture that's stripping all the trees and creating all these landslides. Or, if you're all the way up in the mountains, you need to be dealing with cattle ranching that's destroying the Paramo ecosystem. So I think like that concept holds pretty well, of like at any stage, you really need to be focusing on like what is surrounding the river.
Hey, Jeremy. Hi. I was really struck by how when it was finally time to leave the Amazon, when you thought you were going to spend the end at least the next few months in Asia,
Yeah.
you were kind of torn and you kind of wanted to go back,
Yeah.
and you were thinking about that. And I'm wondering, just given that the year was cut short, if if there was one more thing you could have done there, what might it have been?
Huh.
There, you were talking about making a film or something. I don't remember.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think I would, there's so many gaps in like the story that I managed to tell already. Like, what I just, hammered out in a 30-minute Zoom call is this really like, kind of pixelated, like connect the dots version. And I think there's so many stops along the way of like, of understanding how, like, just understanding this whole system of understanding how the mountains impact the lowlands. And I just think it would be, I think there's projects galore to just kind of keep filling in that information and those, that understanding of the whole picture. Yeah, I mean, I think like, at least in part because it was the like Asian portion of my trip that got cut off. And I think that is where I was really excited to explore, like, the geology of the Himalayas and how that impacts river ecosystems. And like, there's so many more just like whole other categories of like, river processes that I just never got to visit. So I think like right now I'm itching to like go other places first. But I think like the story of the Andes and Amazon is so cool to me. I'm sure I will be back to, explore it more.
Jeremy, I was curious, and thank you so much for the beautiful presentation, but I was curious if you experienced any of the fires there or noticed any of the effects of the fires on the river ecosystem.
Yeah, so I was in Ecuador at the time when those were like really, grabbing a lot of headlines, but I was in the mountains. I was staying in Quito. And I was kind of like debating whether or not I should try and, kind of run down to the Amazon. But it, contrary to what Instagram would have you believe, there was no like one fire that people just like went to. Like it was this massive, super diffuse, super kind of, unorganized, unlocalized phenomenon. So, there was really no way I was really interested to, but I never ended up figuring out a way to just be like, oh, I'm going to go like check out the fires or like see what that is like. Because I think, and then, as for, I don't know, you see the evidence of fire all the time, even from the riverbanks. Like people use it as a main way to, at the end of the harvest season, you in some cases you'll burn the, the remainder of your crops and just like helps fertilize the soil. Like rainforest soils are so nutrient poor that it's a really common way to kind of return organic matter to the soil. But I don't think I ever saw the actual impact of like one of the, the big forest fires.
One thing that I was wondering, Jeremy, was about the relationship between these kind of outsiders coming in and like using the river for these big barges and then the indigenous people there. And I was also wondering if there were any sort of like legal protections to the indigenous people's rights to use the river or the land surrounding the river, or if you could talk a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah, so there's people on this call even who I'm sure would be way more qualified to talk about that. But I don't know, what I did see and kind of learn a fair amount about was just that in many cases there are laws in the books that explicitly protect indigenous people, or even explicitly protect like the rights of nature. So Ecuador has this amazing law that that really specifically says that there are the rights of nature. Nature has rights, and you can't do all these things that are unduly harmful. But I think that the problem throughout these places is getting those things enforced. So the first group of indigenous people that I stayed with, the Kofan in Ecuador, like have been battling tooth and nail for decades to just get like their existing land rights recognized and like prevent the government from allowing like oil drilling on their land. And like there's just all these horrible it's just like unfortunately, and just having it written down somewhere means very little if you don't have a government in place that is really down to fight for that.
Thank you.
I have one more question, if that's okay. So you talked a little bit about experiencing the river in these two very different ways, sort of from a more scientific perspective, and then also from, a more personified or almost spiritual perspective. And I'm curious if experiencing that dynamic might change the way in which you tell stories into the future, or the way um, that you approach, researching something like a river system.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I in my original version of the presentation, I had, an undue number of slides just kind of talking about that, because I think, to me, like, the idea of, I think indigenous worldviews in general are super, super useful and valuable counterpoint and companion to scientific thinking. Like, I think, there's so many things that I find really engaging and exciting and, just useful about the kind of a Western science approach of dissecting phenomenon into their constituent parts and kind of reducing, everything into the smallest possible actor. But I also think that it kind of fundamentally destroys just like some of the magic and some of the understanding that, like, wholes are worth more than the sum of their parts, when it comes to the natural world. And so, I don't know, I really have been trying to figure out how to, like, meaningfully put that into use and into my work, because I think, like, that understanding is so cool to me and so important, and I think, like, is so missing from a lot of the kind of the way that Western organizations or Western scientists think about conservation, or think about, what is important in a river system, or just in anything. So, yeah, I don't know. While I was traveling, we've actually talked about this, Jesse, but while I was traveling the Amazon, on, like, sitting in a hammock on one of those cargo boats, I was reading this book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a really interesting kind of book about reconciling and kind of unifying, this kind of indigenous spiritual understanding of the world, as, as kind of personified and spiritual, with the Western science kind of reductionist approach. And I totally, that book was really, really interesting to me. So if anyone's curious about that, I would highly recommend it.
I have kind of a silly question, I guess, but when you're describing the scariest, most powerful part of the river, and then you're like, oh, and I kayaked down it. Like, wait, what? So can you talk more about what that was like? Was it super dangerous, or was it just kind of a different part? Or I don't know. I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a massive spectrum here. Like, there are, in the course of, like, descending down the Andes, some rivers go over like 200-foot waterfalls. But then there's also, like, whole sections where it's, it's relatively flat, or, a riffle. So kayaking is, not inherently, like, going over the most terrifying part. I was kayaking mostly in Tena, which is it's a city in like, kind of on that eastern, by where that first picture in the presentation was taken. And a lot of the rivers there are kind of on the smaller side. They're like creeks, so they have the potential to be that kind of terrifying, massive, brown, milky, like, churning destruction, but only really during these, like, really isolated periods when you have a flash flood. So, like, that rain, the first picture in the slideshow was that, that rainstorm pummeling this, like, really small valley. And those are the situations in which, like, suddenly these watersheds will triple, quadruple, like, increase by an order of magnitude in terms of the amount of water they're carrying. And, like, those are the situations where you get these kind of crazy, terrifying, dangerous events. And in most of the time, they're much tamer. But that said, I definitely got some kayaking that was very, I kayaked a lot and got significantly better, and I got to do my first class 5 creek, which is the whitewater is graded from 1 to 5, with 5 being, like, the most difficult. And so some of the rivers around Tena are at the highest rating. And by the time I left, I'd done one, which I was really excited about. Franklin or Simone, did you have a question?
I would like to ask a question if no one else.
Yeah,
John,
she.
I was so curious um, about, I think, kind of what Jesse was motioning towards, which was, you know, I like how deep into like how deep off the river and into the forest did you go to talk to different indigenous communities? Because I think like one of the things, the one I during my gap year, I spent some time in the Amazon in Ecuador off of Puyo in Sachayacu, working at the animal rescue center there. And one thing I was struck by was like how, and you motioned this already, like how deeply in a lot of these industries go and how not untouched anything is anymore. And there's just a lot more traffic going on. And a lot of the times it's exploitative, but on another end, a positive way to look at it maybe is that a lot more stories come out from the villages there. And so what I was wondering was that a big part of your project that maybe couldn't fit into these 30 minutes was that you were collecting these stories from different villagers? And did you feel like these were stories, did it feel touristy, you know, because that can happen too, and or did it feel like there was a lot of actually great communication that was going on between like conservationists and indigenous groups and like the oral historians in those areas?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, fundamentally, like I struggled a lot with figuring out like what my role was throughout this trip. I think like, you know, I find like, you know, indigenous worldviews and like the way that these people think about these things super interesting. I find, you know, the lifestyles that are being carried out and preserved here like really valuable and amazing. But it's hard to come in and successful and ethically, you know, document that or share that or just like be a part of those stories as, you know, a white American dude. And I think like it's, yeah, I just like sometimes I think I just let the stress of like not knowing how to do it right prevent me from doing it at all. And sometimes it was just like physically super difficult. Like language barriers were super prominent, you know, even in places where people spoke Spanish, which I speak reasonably well. Like if we were both speaking our second language, then like it would be really hard to communicate. So I think I struggled both with the, you know, the front end of just like, do I try and seek out these stories? Do I try and like start these communication? Do I try and document this? Do I try and, you know, film these people or take photos of them? But then also like the actual act of doing it was really difficult. So all that to say that like, I think that was something I didn't do all that much on my trip. And, you know, to my mom's question earlier, like something I think I would love to do if I figured out a good way to do it in the future. On a broader scale, I think like it's hard. I don't know, it's hard to look at like the way that the Amazon is being explored and exploited and extracted and feel like, you know, predominantly excited about like the fact that new stories are coming out and new access is coming out. Cause I think most of the time that the direction of that change and that kind of pressure is, it's not exactly voluntary for, you know, for these groups that are being affected.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That was just like that was the only positive spin I could put on it, really. But I was also curious if you found any voices on the road that you had wanted to amplify. Like that's also my thing, is my frustration with so many like Western Nat Geo based, you know, people who are trying to do the good work, but also I feel like they don't center the actual voices.
Sure.
That, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the projects that I was really excited about that, you know, was kind of the pretext or the context for me being in these places and with these communities in the Amazon was making the story map. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with ArcGIS. That's these story maps that are basically it's like basically a PowerPoint, but it's linked to a GIS map. And we used that technology to basically digitize and you know, solidify this whole expansive, you know, world of oral history that people had around their river. So we like, you know, this organization that I was working with had already gone out and like gotten all of these tribal leaders to like draw out on big sheets of construction paper, like, this is our river, these 4 places are where we fish, this is where so and so saw this thing, this is where all of these myths that are related to like the rubber era, and all of this violence that has occurred, and also all these like amazing understandings of how the river works and how to fish, and just like all of this knowledge. And then they geo-referenced that and actually like built a GIS map out of it. And then I kind of came in and helped supply photos to like actually make that a little more of a rich experience. But I think like that is a really cool application to me of like technology and exposure in that sense, like actually enables these people to kind of lithify what has been in many ways like abstract and therefore kind of disrespected or misunderstood. I can send a link to the story map if you guys are curious. It's all in Spanish.
Yes, we want it.
Let's see. I'll have to figure out how to. I'll probably have.
We do have a question.
Say again. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So we're kind of curious about what happens to all these sediments and nutrients after they go through the Amazon floodplain.
Yeah.
So when the river reaches the ocean, does that have any effects on the ocean waters?
Yeah.
Near the Amazon region, and what are the effects? And
totally, yeah. So this is like, I could nerd out all day about this stuff, but like basically, first of all, like the whole Amazon floodplain is literally like built of the broken down Andes. Like before the Andes were tectonically uplifted, the Amazon drained in the other direction. It like the rise of the Andes fully reversed the way that whole drainage flowed, because by providing that kind of that elevation, and as they were eroded and like brought out, those sediments actually make up the ground that underlies pretty much most of the Amazon rainforest, and kind of continues to fertilize it to this day. As the river, the sediments that are still in the river that don't get deposited somewhere on that plain create this insane plume that projects like 60-70 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. And the tales of like people discovering the mouth of the Amazon, or like arriving to it for the first time from Europe, like the ocean is drinkable like 60 miles offshore, where you can't even see land, because the Amazon is dumping more water than the next 7 largest rivers in the world combined. And yeah, so there's all sorts of like those sediments, those sands end up building like the beaches of like the whole South American coast. You have the mangrove forests in like Guyana that are made up and underlined by Amazon sediments that originally came from the Andes. You have these crazy ecosystems that actually exist under the plume that are constantly being coated in in sediments and sand that like exist nowhere else, because they're so adapted to this unusual environment. So there's all sorts of like crazy shit, but like, yeah, basically like the way, this transport system impacts so much.
Yeah, I was going to ask almost the exact same question, but you did skip over that amazing aerial slide of the white and black rivers combining.
Yeah.
Just explain that aerial, because it's an amazing picture.
Let's see if I can pull this up while I talk about it. Yeah, so this is one of my favorite photos from the whole trip, and it's basically it's the confluence of a whitewater river with a blackwater river. So the black water, the stuff that's coming in from the kind of the top of the frame, are these rivers that originate on the actual Amazon floodplain. They they come from just the slow moving swamps where there's really not a lot of erosion going on. And then these other rivers that come from an Andean origin are carrying this insane quantity of sediments. They're just completely loaded out with silt. And so when they collide, when they merge with each other, as these watersheds kind of come together, you get these really spectacular just like confluences and displays where they meld. This is like one of my favorite phenomenons anywhere, but it's really cool too, because the water with all the sediments in it is actually heavier, because it literally has rocks in it. And so when they collide, you see they kind of form this amazing wedge as like the heavier white water sinks underneath and like curls under the black water. And so you get these crazy swirling mixtures that extend for miles and miles downstream. The really classic example of this is right below Manaus, where the two biggest tributaries come together. One of them's Blackwater and one of them Whitewater. And literally for like 10 miles downstream, the whole left side of the river is black and the whole right side of the river is white.
Jeremy, which one is this? Which rivers?
This is actually kind of just like a random, fairly small tributary. I don't actually even remember what the Blackwater River is called, but the Whitewater is the Amazon. So it was just like this was during my, while I was traveling on the river boats, we just like stopped in some small town. This river, was pretty small, but it was coming out from just like, some other part of the Amazon, and it was joining the Amazon River, and it created this pretty amazing confluence, like right by where we were docked. So I flew my drone up. This is all taken at like 5 a.m., which is why it's kind of grainy.
That's like a 30-foot boat.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you can barely see like the little driver in the very back by his hat. Well, so it's 1:00. So thank you guys so much for coming. I hope this was interesting and not too mired by technical difficulties. Yeah.
Awesome.
If anyone wants to see that story map, I'm gonna try and pull up the link and send it to myself and send it in the chat really fast. Anyone have more questions?
I had a question, Jeremy.
Yeah.
I was just curious to hear a little bit about what like assumptions or preconceived notions you had of the Amazon, like either scientifically or thinking about the ways people interacted with it, and then just like a couple examples of that and how that changed
All right.
over your journey along the Amazon.
I was multitasking during like one small section of that. So thinking about what changed.
Just like some or assumptions you had about the Amazon, like either scientifically or how people interacted with it.
Totally.
Yeah, what changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about this really briefly, just in talking about like indigenous worldviews. But I think like going into it, I think it was hard not to kind of have this attitude of like, oh, like I understand this in a cool way, and like everyone's going to be really excited about understanding in that way as well, which is kind of the conceit of science communication writ large. But it was interesting to to just meet people who were very, very content with like understanding the river in exactly the way they did and living on it in the way they did. And I think like the concept that like, yes, this like science is here to save the day notion, in the way that got undermined was definitely something I kind of had to just be like, okay, like, I am, predominantly here to learn and not teach. So it was definitely an interesting way to step back into that. I also think, I think like this is kind of the phenomenon of traveling everywhere, but you just realize that like these places which are in so many, like I think for a long time, for most of my life, like the Amazon was this kind of pinnacle of exoticism of like, crazy, just mystery jungle. But like fundamentally when you arrive, you relate to people there, like human life everywhere on earth is so much more similar than it is different. Like people, I don't know, it was interesting to humanize and just kind of, I guess, regularize the place. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Can't wait for the book.
Yeah.
Hopefully coming soon.